Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Dafina Williams. I am OFN's EVP of External Affairs, and today's webinar is all about getting your feedback on the CDFI Fund's request for comment on their main grant program, so the Financial and Technical Assistance and Native CDFI Assistance Programs. We do have two webinars this week, today's session, and then one tomorrow, also at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we really wanted to break things up by size, by asset size, so we can make sure that we really hear the input of smaller CDFIs in this session today. Today's session will also focus more on some of the questions related to the Small and Emerging CDFI Assistance Program, or SECA. Just quick housekeeping before we get started. We are hoping to have a very interactive session with all of you this afternoon, where we walk through some of the questions being asked by the CDFI Fund, but then we really want to pause and turn it over to you to hear your perspectives. So as we move throughout the presentation, we have some discussion questions that will be facilitated by my colleague, Jennifer Vasiloff. And we want to invite you to unmute yourself, come on screen, and share your thoughts directly. So to be placed in the queue to come on camera with us, or to just verbally let us know what you're thinking, please make sure to use the hand raising function. And of course, as usual, questions and comments can be placed in the Q&A section or in the chat if you prefer, if you would not be interested in speaking. So looking forward to hearing from all of you today. Next slide, please. So a bit of background before we dive in. This really marks the first time that the FATA NAC applications have gone through a substantive update since around 2017. While a lot of this is under what's called the Paperwork Reduction Act questions, so they're asking about whether the questions are appropriate to really address what the CDFI Fund is evaluating, and asking whether character limits or things like that make sense. There are actually some pretty interesting policy questions in this request for comment that'll impact the direction of the application and who gets funded, how much funding they get, and what types of information the fund is going to be looking for. And that's really where we're going to focus a lot of our attention today. So this request for comment, again, is going to be hitting on some of these policy areas. We'll dive deeper into that, but most notably, the request for comment is going to actually impact the timing of upcoming funding rounds. So while the exact date for when the next round has not been set yet, we expect it to be sometime in fall 2023. And this will be a combined FY 2023 and FY 2024 funding round in a single application round. That timeline is so that the CDFI Fund actually has the chance to get public feedback through this request for comment, and then actually incorporate that into the new application. So that's why we have a little bit of a delay this year. This request for comment actually closes on May 12th, and OFN is, of course, planning on submitting comments, and we welcome your feedback to help shape those comments, but also encourage you to submit any feedback or comments directly to the CDFI Fund based on your experience applying for and receiving these grants. Next slide, please. So here, this is just a link to some of the relevant documents that you will need to respond. You should have gotten a copy of the PowerPoint already, but we will also make this available after the fact. So you can just use these links directly to the Federal Register notice, and you'll find everything you need there, including instructions on how to submit your comments. Next slide. So before we kind of get into the actual content of what's going in the comment letter, I wanted to just set the stage a little bit with some data points on just the current status of the financial assistance program that we think will be relevant to this conversation. So what you see here is a chart that shows the average award size over time. So as you can see, there's been a little bit of volatility, I think, in that average award amount over time, but it's been on a pretty steady decline since about 2017, where the CDFI Fund really changed its application and review process, as well as its maximum award amount, to focus on giving more awards to more CDFIs, but in smaller dollar amounts. So kind of spreading the awards over a larger group of CDFIs. Of course, the average award amount is going to be limited by both the size of the annual appropriations, but also by the number of applicants. And so You see funding levels over the history of the CDFI fund were sort of creeping up by 10 or 15 or $20 million at a time, but we're also seeing a growth in the number of certified CDFIs. And so as more people apply, the fund is looking to kind of make sure that there's funding that goes to all different CDFI types and sizes. And so that helps to explain why we've seen that declining award size over time. Next slide. And this chart actually shows the number of awardees over time. So for both of these charts, the blue line is all awardees. The orange line just represents OFN members. So you can see dramatic growth in the number of awardees from the program's inception in 1996 to the current year, which, as I mentioned, makes a lot of sense just given how much the industry has grown in the number of certified CDFIs over that time and the number of applicants to the program. But you can see from this chart that, the number of awardees was relatively flat until about 2008, and then we see it increasing. And then in 2017, you really see that growth accelerate again, which again is based on some of the policy changes implemented the last time the fund really took a look at these applications. And as I mentioned before, made a decision to make more awards to a larger number of CDFIs and help to bring that kind of average award size down. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to go through today in our agenda before I turn it over to Jennifer. Next slide, please. So we're going to dig in a little bit to some of the specific questions that the CDFI fund is asking, but due to limitations on the amount of time we only have an hour scheduled for this webinar. We're not going to ask your input on every single question that's being asked in the Federal Register notice. But we do encourage you to go and read through everything that's in there. And if there's something that we don't hit on today, but you still want to respond to, or you'd like to weigh in on in OFN's comments, please feel free to reach out to us directly. We want that feedback as well. But again, we're going to focus in on some of those big policy questions today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the fund's proposal to use a multiplier as part of its performance goals and measures, which is a new kind of proposal on their end. We're going to talk about how financial assistance program could or should be better serving Native communities, both within the NACA program and outside of it. The CDFI fund is also asking some questions about whether it should consider what they're calling deep impact lending from the Emergency Capital Assistance Program or the ESIP program. And we'll get into a little bit about what they means later. They're also asking some questions about, the use of financial assistance to help a CDFI's balance sheet and its financial viability. So they're wanting to know whether net asset ratios, something we're all very familiar with in the CDFI industry, is an appropriate measure of how a CDFI is leveraging its financial assistance award. And then there's some questions at the very end around, whether a CDFI should be reliant on financial assistance awards at all to be considered financially viable. So we want to make sense. We want to hear from you about what makes sense for your CDFI, of course, and also hear from you around what you think OFN should be recommending to the fund in our comment letter. So before I turn it over to Jennifer, just want to reiterate that we would love for this to be an interactive session so that, Jennifer and I are not just talking to each other for the next 45, 50 minutes. So please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourselves, chat with us, let us know what you're thinking, but of course use that Q&A function as well so that we can capture all of your feedback. We are recording this, we will make it available to all of you afterwards, but you weighing in just helps us have a clearer record of where our members are in this issue and helps us to better shape comments that reflect those positions. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jennifer and we can go through our discussion today.
Thank you, Tafina. And on our agenda, we will be sure to get to the CECA program also. I think we neglected to put it on the previous slide because we're preparing one deck for today's session and tomorrow's session, but CECA will be something we ask you about today. So the fund is tightening up some aspects of the application. They propose to have applicants identify one financial assistance objective instead of the option to identify several. They've also cut back on some of the choices of objectives. Going forward, applicants could choose one of the following objectives: increase volume of financial products, a new geographic area, new financial products, or new targeted populations. They eliminated a few options because they were difficult to measure, and very few applicants actually chose those options. So a little bit of streamlining, as I understand it. One of the interesting recommendations that they are floating that I'd be very interested in people's reaction to is this concept of a multiplier, which some of us are still having bad dreams about the CRA multiplier conversation. This is a little different. It seems to be, sort of an evolution from what the current practice is in looking at sort of historic lending experience with the CDFIs, and then, what an award might allow the awardee to do going forward. So in the example here, it shows a CDFI that has $10 million in historic lending. And if that CDFI received a $1 million FA award, would it be reasonable to expect, using a multiplier of 2, that, over the terms of the award agreement, that they would be able to do $12 million in lending? So what do people think? Or Defina and I can talk amongst ourselves and come up with something ourselves. Part of the question here is will this look really different from what your current experience has been? Is this like way more? Is a multiplier of 2 the right number, or maybe some other number? So Brian has some suggestions, it looks like.
I'll take a stab at answering. It's hard to evaluate on the fly. So that's the first thing I'll say. The other thing I'll say is that for those of us that were selecting increase in volume of financial products in the past, it's always been a little confusing the way they've done it in the past. And this seems like it might be easier to understand, which I would favor that. But another thing that's been confusing in the past is if you select volume of financial products multiple years in a row, you had this like ratcheting up floor, and that was super confusing for me. And I don't understand what would happen with the multiplier from what you're saying. If you had if you got an award 3 years in a row, how would that interplay? Would there be that? I think you understand the question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that if you say you applied in 2023, and going back to the example that they gave in the Federal Register, that your historic for the past 3 years was 10 million. In your assistance agreement, I would think going forward for that award, you'd be expected to go up to 12. But then if you applied again in 2024, right, they would, the base years would change. But that's just my read, which may or may not be what the CDFI fund had in mind. Brian, do you think that this is potentially more clear than what they currently do, or not sure?
It's potentially more clear, but again, it's hard to evaluate on the fly and hard to evaluate from the slide. And the previous way of doing it was always a little opaque to me, so that also makes it hard to evaluate. But I'd almost need to see it in a workbook side by side in order to give a final assessment. But I'm open to it, and it seems like it might be more clear.
Thank you. I will call people's attention to, in addition to the Federal Register notice, they have posted sort of versions of the FA and the TA applications with sort of strikeouts where they are deleting a question or a criteria, and then highlighted new information. And so something like this, you can sort of look at what was there and what they're proposing, and maybe get a better sense of how it might work for your organization. There are other comments?
We do have a couple in the chat. I think there's a desire just for some more clarity and some additional information around how this might actually work in practice. A couple comments saying this might make sense for some organizations, but perhaps not others. And, just is the fund looking at any data to come up with the appropriate multiplier? So, I think those are all fair. And I think we have another person who wants to come on screen. So I think James.
Yeah, my question would be about it, and thinking about the multiplier as a small emerging CDFI. 1 year we may have 400,000 in lending. The next year we may have 600,000. The 3 years back we may have had 200,000. And I found it difficult in getting an award because of our size and scope of our business. So is that something that's going to be considered in this as it moves forward?
I don't know. Are you on your way to suggesting that perhaps SECA applicants, would be treated differently than like the applicants to the core program around this multiplier issue, or is it
or maybe? Or maybe if looking at the size of the CDFI and the multiplier, if you're a smaller emerging CDFI, maybe the qualifications or the multiplier is a little different, a little more open, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Looks like we do have some support in the chat for potentially having SECA have a different multiplier or some kind of different formula as well. And that there's, a one size fits all approach might not be the appropriate way for the CDFI fund to get at its objective of making sure that, you're actually providing additional investment in the community with your FA awards.
Other comments about this issue? Are we ready to move on? Let's move on.
I think we had one more person.
I'm sorry,
Alice.
Oh, Alice, great.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I have a couple concerns. I mean, I'm concerned about the fund setting a one size fits all multiplier. I'm also concerned, on the other hand, that if they leave it to us to propose a multiplier, that is then going to become a competitive issue. And so that there's going to be a race to, it will be competitive to increase higher and higher multipliers, and therefore will favor organizations with high growth. So that's one concern. My other concern is that I think that in general, this is simpler. It means that your projected years will have less impact because that won't be what your PG&Ms are going to be based on, your performance goals and measures. But my concern is that the fund understand and have a carve out over the next 2 years at least for PPP lenders. Because for PPP lenders, there's CDFI small business lenders that did PPP lending, their 2020 and 2021 loan volume is significantly higher. And for many, there's no way the next 4 years are going to come, 3 years are going to come close to what the last 3 years look like. Those are my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Tafina, we ready to move on? Okay. The next question that we chose to highlight was, in my notes here, was focused on the ability of an FA awardee to serve Native populations. And do folks have any recommendations or reactions to this change? I was curious when I was reading this, because this is, you know, for the core for the CDFI program, not the NACA program, and I'm wondering if they are trying to capture Native CDFIs that choose to apply for a CDFI program award rather than NACA, because usually they're a little larger, and you know, yet they want to be sure to be able to talk about their credentials in serving Native communities. But it was just my thought. Anything?
Just mostly some requests for more information, which there really wasn't any in the in the Federal Register notice. The fund just kind of dropped this question in there. So I think perfectly fine response to say that we would need a little more context around what the fund is trying to get at with this question. Oh, we've got a couple more comments coming in. I think there's a lot of folks in the chat saying that, you know, perhaps the Native CDFI network would have more opinions about this and would be able to provide better guidance on what makes sense here. Some folks saying that, you know, to give Native CDFIs credit if they're applying for the core program, as opposed to just within the NACA program, and asking if, you know, would you perhaps have to demonstrate a track record of lending in Native communities? So I think just getting at like, what exactly would the fund be looking at or measuring? And, you know, how would you know whether or not someone is or is not serving Native communities? Like what type of data would that require?
And conceivably, they are trying to drive more activity in this direction by, you know, calling it out this way, which is, you know, positive. So let's move on to the next topic, if we could. One of the interesting things I noticed in looking at the marked up application that they have posted is that they've crossed out all the opportunity zone information. You know, that was sort of like the last administration. So they're suggesting not, you know, asking questions about that or tracking that going forward. But instead, they essentially are putting forward a Biden administration idea that was used in the ESIP program, as Defina mentioned earlier, around deep impact lending. And, you know, they have a long list of what might sort of qualify as that. You know, again, pulled from their experience with ESIP. In the ESIP program for depositories, the advantage to the awardee was if they could demonstrate they were doing deep impact lending, the dividend rate, that there was a financial advantage to them. Obviously, that won't work in a grant program, but you know, evidently the fund intends to try to incorporate this in their evaluation of applicants, and you know, perhaps give preference to those applicants that are in a position to you know, meet these deep impact standards. So interested in anyone's observations about that or opinions. Go ahead. What is the definition of deep impact? It's a number of measures. I mean, I'll just list them real quickly from the register. lending or investment to low-income borrowers, mortgage lending to other targeted populations, lending investment in persistent poverty counties, lending or investments in Indian reservations and Native Hawaiian homelands, in U.S. territories, lending investments to underserved small businesses, deeply affordable housing financing, and then public welfare and community development investments. So, you know, fairly straightforward, you know, sort of definitions of, you know, that probably makes sense to a lot of us. But again, how you would incorporate that in a grant application process as opposed to what the ESIP process was is a question. Is it part of the evaluation? Do you look at the percentage of overall project activity? Do they look at sort of a percentage of your FA award needing to go to deep impact lending, or a dollar volume? I mean, there's like a lot of ways that they could design it, and it's you know, it's sort of an interesting concept.
I think Brian
more
makes an
thoughts?
interesting point about, you know, how does this kind of interact with the target market definitions, and, you know, how do those two things intersect? And I think we have someone who wants to come on camera. So Ross.
Who might be on mute.
Sorry about that.
There
You
you
know,
go.
under the deep impact, I was going to ask this before the very first question and stuff. So we have a $5 million portfolio, and that's what they always focus on all these. But we have about $30 million off balance sheet from using other participants and other CDFIs, foundations and stuff. So for example, our largest loan we've ever done, I mean, we do microloans and everything, but we did a $4.2 million loan on tribal land with a BIA guarantee and 2 other outside CDFIs. But at the time, we only had $200,000 to put into it. So we were able to basically leverage all this money, and it's on our balance sheet. And we are just $200,000 on the balance sheet with a $4 million loan in a food desert. But we have numbers of that where we lend out other participants money and foundation money, and they love it, but we don't really get credit for the deep impact. In other words, everybody's want to focus on what's on our actual balance sheet, what is our money, which looks kind of small, but the impact's big. And I'm always trying to figure out how to do that. And that kind of flowing back to your last question, sorry, I hit it. On native lands and stuff, we work with 7 different tribes where we are, and they just don't have the CDFI skill set we do. So we always, you know, kind of teaching them and tell them to get back in, and it's a long story, but how do we show that? How do we get credit for all the participations that we have?
In that example, Ross, would it, you know, if I understand it correctly, you know, your organization's actual investment might be more modest, but you have all this, you know, other funds that you're bringing to the project. Would it still look as a percentage of your overall business on balance sheet, you know, be a percentage that you know, the fund would recognize and as a deep impact potentially?
Yes, that's the main. Well, even our lending it could be $3 million one year and 20 the next and back down, and it comprises of, depending who's asking us, well, what if they just want to know what's on our balance sheet? Okay. But we service all these loans, so we made them. We're paying it out as it comes in. We're keeping a smaller percentage, but we don't really on the FA applications. It doesn't really ask. I guess what I'm saying is we don't get credit for doing the volume we do because it's just based on our balance sheet only, not off balance sheet.
Interesting. Thank you.
And there seems to be a lot of agreement in the chat about, not counting these off-balance sheet activities and the impact that might have. And then I think a couple other folks also asking the question, like, aren't CDFIs just by default doing deep impact lending just by the very nature of our work? Which I think gets at, what is the fund actually trying to solve for by adding this additional kind of overlay into the application process?
Good. All right, well, maybe we will move on to this, actually to the next slide, please. This issue around net asset ratio. It seems like the fund wants to prioritize awards to CDFIs that are most effectively leveraging their balance sheet and where an FA award will have the most impact on the CDFI's growth and ability to attract other funds. It's kind of a little hard to get at sometimes, but recognizing that any grant to a CDFI is valuable, it seems like the fund is trying to direct resources to those CDFIs where an FA award will have the most impact on enabling the awardee to leverage other funds. So what do people think about how the fund can best capture this information? Is the net asset ratio the right measure, or is there something else? We all get asked about net asset ratios a lot, but at least it's a familiar term. Any?
I'm back.
Brian?
I mean, these things are hard. Like, I understand why they want to see leverage, but you're asking if this is the right way to measure leverage. I think there's a more fundamental question about whether they should be prioritizing this and to what degree, and again, how it fits. We're trying to raise more debt capital right now, and it's not always easy. And I think it's for larger CDFIs that have more established track record, more bank relationships, it's easier for them to attract leverage. And for smaller or mid-size, I'd call us mid-size, just expecting that we're going to, like, I get it, like our net asset ratio should easily allow us to be able to borrow more capital, but there's limited sources and you need the relationships. And right now, like, we need to borrow more capital and we're having a little bit of a challenge around it. So I'm really looking forward to the next CDFI round where we can get some more capital.
Interesting. I mean, to paraphrase what you're saying, it's like, just because you get a CDFI fund award doesn't mean you automatically can attract the debt that helps you do more.
Oh man, there's been this idea batted around about like Treasury creating some sort of debt capital pathway for CDFIs. I've heard in the past, like if you want us to be able to leverage your award, like create a debt product that we can leverage our award with, that we don't have to go beg into banks to try to get affordable debt capital. Like, I'd be happy to borrow money, but it's not always so simple. And I think that's that's the biggest thing that pops out to me. Yeah, sure, net asset ratio is a fine way to measure it, but there could be real, I think, detrimental unintended consequences of putting too much focus on it.
Thank you.
And I think we have a couple of really interesting comments that have come in the chat. One is whether the fund's going to be looking at either percent of leverage or the dollar amount of leverage when they're evaluating this. And then just a couple more, one is maybe they could use a debt to equity ratio that is dedicated to lending, because net asset ratio is something that might be able to kind of be gamed a little bit for, you know, more sophisticated applicants to the program. And then I think a lot of support for Brian's comments and asking, you know, if you can access debt capital, then does that impact how the fund kind of views the award you might get, or would that, you know, harm your application if they think you don't necessarily need the capital, or just like how would this actually impact the actual award process?
Interesting. Okay. Are we ready to talk about SECA? All right, let's move on. I suspect that folks on this call are familiar with SECA, or are potential awardees of this program. And the fund, you know, seems to be, you know, committed to carrying it forward, but is exploring some reforms or changes, or you know, a little more than tweaks. We want to hear from you about what you think about some of these questions. And you know, the first one that's listed here is essentially, is it, you know, 3 strikes and you're out? Do you graduate from SECA to core at some automatic time? I think this concept of graduating from the CDFI fund, the CDFI program, or graduating from SECA to core, it feels perennial to me, but we're kind of seeing it a little bit in this question. Any thoughts? All right, well, we can go to the next slide, because they've got a lot of questions about SECA, and you might have ideas about some of the others.
And there's a couple coming in.
Great, Tufina, go ahead.
That and I think we'll actually get to some of these comments in some of the next slides, but that the SECA portfolio size should be increased. So I guess what counts as small, you know, they should increase that number. And that there should be like an intermediate pool of capital in between SECA and core for those CDFIs that may not fit kind of into either, which I think is really interesting.
What about sort of the time aspect of it? That's the sort of the 4 years, or sort of the financing activity start date. Are there any opinions about that? Is that, you know, what they're doing now seem reasonable to folks? That's another question that we'll want to speak to in our letter to the fund. Okay, the next slide, if I remember correctly, has what they're suggesting in terms of changes to, you know, their definition of small and emerging. And for unregulated institutions, they're suggesting raising the asset size to $7.5 million. It's currently $5 million. Does that seem like a reasonable reform? Any thoughts on that question?
And while we're waiting for those comments to come in, it does seem like there's some consensus in the chat that small CDFI should not be forced into competing in the core pool.
So the time limit is problematic. So three SECA awards, and then you can't apply for SECA anymore is not a popular proposal. Is that your take?
That's my take.
Okay.
And some support for raising the threshold to 7.5 million, which the fund indicated, you know, that would be, you know, based on sort of inflation, and it hasn't been raised in, you know, many years.
Okay. Another reform, which I think is listed on the next slide, is kind of is sort of a flip of what we've already talked about a little bit, which is even if you are small and emerging per the CDFI funds definition, and you under current rules, you can still apply for a core FA award if you choose to. And you know, a reason you might choose to do that is because it could be larger. And they're proposing to not allow that anymore. And I don't know how many CDFIs sort of fit into that set of circumstances, but is there any feedback about that?
Just a few more are coming in. There's a slight delay in how
Yeah,
fast
I'm
the
sorry.
comments come in.
People
So
on the spot.
I think the few more, I think there is some support for that 7.5 million, but not limiting the number of times you can apply for SECA. And the comment that said when a CDFI that did apply for SECA applied for core, they actually ended up getting the SECA amount of money anyway. So it didn't seem like it was a big benefit to them of competing in that bigger pool. And then that, you know, funding should be thinking about how the actual like funds are allocated to give more funding to SECA, to smaller CDFIs, to you know, kind of invest more in that smaller pool, because that is actually what it helps CDFIs grow to be able to get to that core pool. So
yeah, you might remember this more than I did, Fina. I mean, it seems like there's a cap now for how much can be allocated to SECA, but I'll go back and check on that. But I mean, that might be something to explore. And I'm interested in the suggestion someone made too about, you know, maybe another in-between category that would be appropriate for some CDFIs.
seems
All
to
right.
be, just
ahead.
I think, you know, we don't seem to be getting a lot of concern about the $700,000 cap for SECA, because as we mentioned in our earlier slides, you know, the average award size is getting much smaller, and it is right around, you know, $700,000 right now. So
Not that big a difference. Right. So, all right, well, let's move on to the next issue, which is, to me anyway, this again has sort of echoes of the graduation concept, where, you know, per the statute, an awardee of the CDFI program should not be so dependent on that award that they're going to go out of business or not be viable if they're not successful that year. And that's sort of been long-standing policy. This seems to be taking it to another level, which is more what would it take for a CDFI to be viable without CDFI fund awards, and is an investment perhaps over a 3 to 5 year period in order to get the CDFI to a certain state, a strategy that the CDFI fund should consider. Kind of a interesting set of questions, but I wonder if folks have ideas about this. I see the question from Brian about multi-year funding for SECA applicants. This would be for all applicants, but I think that they are, I've heard, it seems like Noel Poyo has talked about some version of this in a speech that I attended, where, you know, would it be helpful, or would it be a strategy the CDFI fund should consider to essentially consider a multi-year strategy with a particular applicant, where the applicant, if they knew they were going to get a certain amount over a period of years, you know, that could drive certain business decisions that might make them more viable for the long term. It's an interesting question. There's trade-offs, obviously. What does it mean for the rest of the applicants, given the limited funding? Exactly. You know, I mean, if you're going to make a bet on a particular CDFI and stick with them for multiple years, you know, that's committing future, you know, this committing resources that, you know, other CDFIs could be competing for. So it's certainly a trade-off. So.
I think there's some interesting comments coming through around, you know, getting at the heart of this question, like, is it not the intention of the financial assistance program to strengthen CDFIs? You know, was that not the point? And I think that's, you know, something that we've heard a lot. This has been a conversation that I feel like has been going on in the industry for a while around, you know, what CDFI fund awards are for. And I think, okay, so there are a lot of questions coming in that, yeah, like, it's really difficult to sustain and grow CDFIs, especially small ones, you know, with the limited pot of funding. And a suggestion that if we opened a window at Treasury for CDFIs to access low-cost capital, that could potentially offset, you know, years where there are no grant funds. I think a lot of this is getting at something that is near and dear to Jennifer and ours heart, which is we need to grow the pie for everyone. We need a bigger appropriation so that we're not sort of, you know, fighting over the small pot of financial assistance award when so many CDFIs need it. And yeah, I think there's some support for, you know, having a discount window or some opportunities to get, you know, cheap capital from Treasury.
Exactly. Does anyone want to make remarks to the group or share any other suggestions about this? All right. Well, at this point, when we bump to the next slide and invite folks to, before we sort of close up, raise up any other issues about the FA or TA or NACA programs that OFN might have an opportunity to make recommendations about, or obviously everyone on this call can make recommendations about. Davina and I chose the issues we did, you know, because we thought they were most important, but there might be other ones that other folks want to draw attention to. So kind of an open invitation for any other comments or advice. All right. Well, we have a few more weeks before we have to submit our letter, and this is not the only time that you have an opportunity to not only sort of inform OFN about what we might say, but you know, sort of let's work together on getting the best set of recommendations into the fund. We have a plan, you know, tomorrow we're having a similar webinar with some of the larger asset size CDFIs and OFN's members. We're also coordinating and collaborating and talking to some of the other kind of affinity groups in the CDFI industry, the CDFI Coalition, the Native CDFI Network, which was mentioned previously, you know, and others. So, you know, we are taking this opportunity to potentially influence what the fund does with these programs, you know, pretty seriously, because it's you know, it's a core resource to the industry. I guess we'd move to the next slide. Or Davina, are there any other comments or questions that you want to raise up?
Just that, you know, people are interested in seeing any draft letter or some kind of template that we might pull together after we kind of hear from our membership. So we will work on getting something for all of you to look at so that you can submit your own comments. And of course, we always welcome you reaching out to us directly, whether it's something that you think of afterwards or if you have some time to sort of process what the fund is asking. Please feel free to reach out to Jennifer or I about it. And, you know, just thank you all for participating in this webinar this afternoon. You know, it was really helpful to be able to hear directly from you about how these changes might impact your CDFI. And we look forward to continuing to work with you on this and many other policy issues. So like I said, reach out if you have anything else you'd like to share, but we appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thank you.